Interested in installing composite decking? Well, these are my top tips on how to install to make a picture-perfect deck project come to life.
I've worked on numerous composite decking projects, and there always seems to be a few particulars that come with working with composite material, but some of these tips are just going to be straightforward tips which would benefit any deck installation project. From my perspective, the most professional looking decks always have a picture frame associated with it so you don't see any of the ends of the boards. In order to do so, the first step of this entire decking installation project is to bring the first board to your miter saw and cut a 45-degree mitered corner on one side. For this particular project, we are going to be installing fascia board, which leads me into top tip number 1.
Your spacing for your fascia boards is key.
Depending on the thickness of your fascia board, you should always give yourself approximately 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of extra space and leeway in order to guarantee that variances within your framing don't affect the overall look of your fascia board. In our circumstance, our fascia board comes a 1/2 inch thick, and I'm actually accounting for 3/4 of an inch of space. This is because there's always going to be slight variances within your framing, and if you account for this ahead of time, you're never going to notice that variance because you're just going to notice a beautiful and seamless fascia board right underneath your decking. With one mitered corner under our belt, we can start moving in the vast majority of our lumber, and this is for a number of reasons. Number 1 being it's a lot easier to work on a deck if you have a decking material already laid out, and 2, it seems to make the spacing portion of the deck project much more straightforward. And that leads me into my top tip number 2, is to space everything out prior to installing. Our deck boards are 5.5 inches wide, and by accounting for a 1/4 inch of space in between each board, I come out to approximately a 1/2 board thickness at the very end. However, that's where these Wise Guides deck spacers from DeckWise are actually really nice to use because they come in multiple thicknesses, so I reduce it down to 13/64, and that gives me a much more substantial board at the very end, which you'll see why it's so important later on the video if you stay tuned to the end. But this leads me perfectly into my next top tip: don't leave any factory edges on your entire deck project. Now, they might look clean and they might look straight, but most of these edges have slight variances in one direction over the other, and they aren't perfectly straight. That's why I always make sure to cut every single factory edge, even if I'm cutting off a very small amount to butt up against our perimeter board. Once I have my spacers in place, I then secure that one side down and make my way down to the other side, which leads me into my next top tip. The only saw you need is a circular saw. That's right, I cut all these boards in place on the deck with a circular saw, and the only time I use something else is when I'm doing my perimeter boards with my miter saw or ripping something down with my table saw. But those two are luxuries, and I'm only using those because they do make the job easier. However, you certainly could get the job done with just a circular saw if you didn't have those tools.
In order to get an extremely straight line all the way down, took a string line, just ran it across all the way over and pulled it extremely tight on this other side. That way I know for certain that we have a very straight line to work off of when we install this first board all the way across, as well as cross measuring it to the other side to make sure that the same distance from the house to this board is accurate. And it is, so we can start installing.
With the position of this very first board accounted for, the rest of the decking really comes together extremely quickly and efficiently compared to getting to this point, because we're going to be working off of these first 2 boards, and that means that as long as these first 2 boards are correct and we're using our spacers accordingly, the rest of these boards should look perfect all the way down this entire deck. As we move on to installing the majority of our deck boards, it's a perfect time to start talking about fasteners. And that's where my next top tip comes into play, because with all this money spent on the decking, you certainly don't want to skimp on the fasteners themselves, because if you saw me demoing out this entire project, the reason why I had to take a reciprocating saw to every single one of those fasteners was because they corroded over time, and they weren't installed that long. It was only a decade or two that they were installed, but they still corroded tremendously to the point where you couldn't even unscrew them. My favorite fasteners to use for composite decking is these Cortex fasteners that actually have an amazing system built into it, because you're able to perfectly screw it down into place at the correct depth thanks to this specially drill bit. But it also comes with caps that you can install right on top of them, which not only protects the fastener over time because you're concealing it from the weather, but it also comes with plugs which perfectly matches your decking. And that's obviously something we'll get to later down the road on this deck project. But for now, it's time to water your deck.
Remember to water your deck. Yeah, I know it doesn't sound normal to do, but just because this is plastic doesn't mean that it doesn't expand and contract. If you try and screw this down when it's beating red hot, guess what? It's going to expand and contract when it starts cooling down. And to make sure we don't have any issues with our seams getting all of a sudden much bigger or much smaller, you want to make sure they're wet down or they're in the shade before you install. Note to self.
Keeping your deck boards cool with a hose really does work, but works even better is just make sure you keep the deck boards in the shade prior to installing, and that will keep them a consistent temperature versus being very hot before you start installing. In terms of general layout for a deck, in my personal opinion, deck divider boards are actually the best looking deck out there. However, that doesn't always work, and I have done those in previous videos, but on this deck project, we went with a random seam pattern. Keep in mind that with these seam layouts, I don't suggest doing anything under 16 inches, just to make sure you have plenty of structural support underneath a small section of decking.
As you're looking at the seams over here, you can see a seam, 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 and then we have one with no seams. So that's where the random pattern really kicks into play, because you're able to figure out which board needs to go next just based upon which one doesn't have a seam. Easy enough.
As I inch my way closer and closer and closer to the house, it's seemingly becoming more apparent that my calculations at the very beginning for spacing was actually correct, because the last and final board of this entire run was a full piece with 0 rip cuts needed. Definitely a satisfying aspect of any deck related project. However, on this project we have a uniquely shaped deck, which is why we now have to focus our efforts on the front portion of the deck. I cut one mitered corner, but I actually saved the next one until I get to the very end of this run, just to guarantee that I have everything fully aligned. But just as we did to the previous section, the one perimeter board, along with the one board that we lined up with our string line at the very beginning, sets the precedent of all the other boards that need to be installed. The only thing we need to figure out through this entire process is where we're going to be placing our seams. With all of our deck boards fully installed except for our perimeter boards, I can now move my efforts back to the perimeter board that I left long, cut that mitered edge, making sure it's 3/4 of an inch long on the very end to account for our fascia board, and move on to the next section. As I make my way to the final side of this deck, I can start implementing another top tip, making sure that you're utilizing a guide, as in cutting guide, whenever possible. This is an extremely important cut, and it's only a cut you want to make once, and therefore making sure you have a nice even guide to allow your circular saw to have precision accuracy is very important.
When doing this type of work, it is important to make sure you have some type of board here to guide your circular saw perfectly straight, because even if you have a very steady hand, it is very difficult to get this perfectly straight the very first time. As well as when your circular saw, make sure you're using an ultra fine blade for this type of cut, because you want this cut perfectly straight and crisp without any tear out the very first time you do it.
The nice added bonus when doing this cut is all the beautiful rain that has shown up finally here in the Pacific Northwest, which unfortunately does happen eventually, but we have to work through it. And luckily for us, I have done this numerous times, so it's not too much of a big ask or effort. Just make sure you're not going all the way through into your border board, because we are salvaging that and we are using a multi-tool to cut any of the remainder off at that location. And as you can see, I am having to do this cut with the multi-tool on every single one of these boards, and that's because I set a pre-depth for our circular saw so I didn't go too deep and penetrate our joist tape. Once that's taken care of, I then remove our guide and start installing the remaining portion of our border. I use the same fascia board as a guide for the smaller section of decking that I have to cut out, and once that's taken care of, I then go back around with my multi-tool and remove any of the remainder. However, the last board can't be cut by the circular saw because it's so close to the house, which is why the multi-tool and a speed square does an amazing job at having a nice, consistent cut all the way across. With this last piece completely out of the way, I can move on to installing the remaining 2 pieces of border board, and once those 2 pieces are fully installed, I can move on to installing more fasteners. Yes, we are not done with the fastening because I actually skipped every other bay or every other joist in this circumstance. The key element to making the fastening portion of this project even faster is to incorporate a chalk line, because the chalk line can pinpoint the exact center of the joist below and remove the guessing element of making sure that you're properly securing your decking boards to your joists. Plus, you're basically guaranteed that all of your fasteners are a perfect line all the way down, because every single fastener is placed on the chalk line itself. And of course, chalk makes for easy cleanup with a hose. This really is a nice convenient way of doing approximately half the fasteners like this, because as I noted before, while I was installing the decking boards, I was doing every other bay, and this basically makes the other half of the fastening process much faster. But with our deck boards now finally fully installed, we can move on to fascia. The fascia board that's produced for composite decking generally comes a 1/2 inch thick, and there may be different types of widths to choose from, but with this decking material we had to go with a 12-inch wide board. This material is quite easy to rip down to the proper size, but if you do have a second hand on deck, I would definitely suggest grabbing them because these pieces can be slightly unwieldy. The problem with fascia board is that it is beautiful, however, it will generally see more expansion contraction because of the fact that it's thinner and it's attached to a continuous piece of horizontal pressure treated lumber, which is another reason why it could be more prone to expansion contraction. In order to avoid gap changes over time on outside corners, I'm going to be making a particular fascia board corner specifically for outside corners. The pieces that I cut are 12 inches long, and by taking my table saw, pivoting it to a 45-degree angle, and lowering the blade height to under a 1/2 inch, that allows me to run this piece of fascia board straight through, which gives me a perfect 45-degree angle. Then I flip it over and around and cut the opposite side. This leaves me with about 1/32 of a thickness in the very front of our fascia board, which means all I have to do is apply a small amount of heat with a heat gun to this edge. It will slowly soften because it's plastic and move into the 90-degree angle that I want. Then I apply a bit of clear CA glue on the back side and tape it up so it permanently dries in place in the correct direction. I make a handful of these because I have a number of outside corners, and once I have them all made up, I let them dry and proceed to installing the large runs of fascia board first. With this product going on the face of the ledger board, you do want to apply a secondary method of fastening, which is simple enough for any exterior construction adhesive, but I do suggest making sure you run vertical beads versus horizontal beads, because if there is moisture that gets behind there, you want to allow the moisture to run down so it doesn't trap any moisture against your ledger board. Once your outside corners are dry, you then take the tape off and you can start installing your beautiful fascia board corners that never come apart over time. And that's why this is another top tip for composite decking. As you can see, I did find myself into a nice rainstorm as I was finishing up our fascia board, but once I got to the very end, I quickly realized that I might be a little short when it comes to fascia, but luckily, I prepared for that and planned accordingly. With composite material, it does come with a price tag, and therefore, if you have an area where you might be able to use waste, we ran out of fascia boards, but on this specific small section, I have a lot of cutoff. And in order to avoid paying another $150 for one piece of fascia board, I'm just gonna take a couple pieces of scrap and put it on this section, because of the fact that you're barely gonna see this anyways because it's in the side of the house. So think about that ahead of time if you feel like you're gonna be fairly close to maybe not enough material for your deck project. I'm also using the cut edge at the very top to slide into place. That way you don't see that whatsoever, and you have a nice even look. By doing simple resourceful tasks like this can actually save you quite a bit of money in the long run, so think about that ahead of time on your deck project, because this deck is expensive enough. But now we're done with fascia, so we can get to plugs. So my favorite thing about this fastening system is that it has these amazing caps that come in strips, which makes it even easier to install. And this is a beautiful system because of the fact that you get the strongest hold possible, because you're going straight into the dead center of the board or the fascia board, but you can also easily conceal them with the cap system. It's stopped raining for at least 5 minutes. We'll see if it comes back, but we can install this whether it's rain or shine. These plugs are quite straightforward when it comes to the installation portion of this project, because all you have to do is nail it in place and make sure it's seated properly. But the one thing and key element with these plugs is that you have to also think about the grain direction. The grain direction is quite significant, because if you do want plugs that are nearly invisible to the naked eye, then you need to make sure that the grain direction matches your decking. Luckily for us, these caps that come in these strips generally are the same direction pattern all the way down the line, but they do every once in a while get mixed up in one direction or the other, so you do also need to look at every single one as you're installing. This is not a short process, this does take hours to do, but it is extremely satisfying and gratifying to see all these deck fasteners completely disappear with just a simple cap structure. If you yourself also run into some precipitation as I did, one helpful note to get the vast majority of the moisture out of the holes very quickly and easily is with a leaf blower. Yeah, makes very quick and easy work of all that excess moisture, and it makes it even easier to install the plugs. But with the moisture out of the way, we can now finally get to the rest of our plugs and finishing up this absolutely gorgeous deck. This video was a unique and different style of video that I normally produce, because my stuff is normally very tutorial based, and this was more of just a fun top 10 helpful tips when installing decking. So please let me know in the comment section what you think of this type of video structure, and if you'd like to see more of it or my more normal tutorial based content. But in any case, I'm truly proud to see this amazing deck transformation from start to finish on this project, and how we changed a sad, rough looking deck to something absolutely gorgeous and one of a kind, and that's what I call one beautiful, sexy beast. Oh yeah. And just stay tuned for the next BYOT video, because we have plenty of other things in store for this project, including the fastest railing I've ever installed.